Hello, so I will be talking about some considerations for English language learners, or ELLs for short. A common question uh, about assessing these students with language and cultural differences is how should they be treated in assessment? And depending on the student's language needs, um, we would do different things. For instance, for students who speak a different dialect of English, such as those who speak uh, Black English, a common strategy is to score the test twice, um, once with standard scoring and once with giving correct answers uh, in the dialect that the student speaks. And also, we need to remember that this dialect of English is a different form of English, not an inferior form of English. So we need to be sensitive to the student culture associated with that dialect. And with that being said, we also need to be sure that the test is culturally sensitive to these students as well, because just uh, just because they do speak English doesn't mean that they will showcase their best abilities on the test that uses standard American English. Um, so on that note, we shouldn't over or undercompensate for dialect differences. So we shouldn't assume that the student will be fine just because they speak a dialect of English, and we shouldn't assume that they have a language disability just because they speak a dialect of English either. So there should be this middle ground where we need to be mindful of the language differences associated with different dialects of English. And for English language learners and bilingual or multilingual students, we need to first make sure to determine the proficiency in all the languages the student has been exposed to, including English, and select test batteries uh, based on students' English proficiency. So if the student does not speak English at all, um, the the best course of action would be to assess the student in his or her native language or languages. Um, but when a student has been exposed to English or has been in the school system for a while, the answers sometimes are not as straightforward, and so we will need to assess students in both their first languages and in English to get a better picture of their proficiency levels in all the languages that they know. Um, and another strategy is to use bilingual, multilingual testing professionals um, or qualified interpreters whenever possible. Although a caution with this is to um, make sure that the tests that we're giving the students aren't just being literally translated from English because uh, the, sometimes translations do not carry over very well from language to language, and so that would make the test results invalid at worst and maybe an alternate or informal assessment at best. So, and just like with students who speak dialects of English, we also need to make sure that the tests are culturally sensitive and that the students know what the test is talking about, um, because sometimes students would be able to answer questions if they were worded differently or had a different frame of reference culture-wise. So sometimes students need uh, more or additional services, and some interventions that we can use for students who need these additional services are explicit instruction in in English. So even when we think that the student should know it, we need to be mindful that these students are still learning English, or perfecting their English, and so we need to break everything down into steps, um, and not skip any steps that other students may naturally just pick up on. Um, Using scaffolding is very important too, so that we can guide students towards more and more independent learning. Um, and if at all possible, bilingual education is always a good idea, although sometimes this is not possible given that the with given the wide range of languages spoken by uh, ELL students. And I think the most important consideration for or intervention for students is consistent instruction, because one of the videos that we watched, and even the text also mentioned that students are often switched back and forth from English only instruction to instruction in their native languages to a combination of both. And so uh, not a single way of teaching this is correct, um, but we need to uh, stick to a consistent pattern of instruction so that the student gets the most out of that instruction. And for students who need additional services, they can also be referred for special education. And keeping in mind that this is always a last resort for students who are struggling in school, and to use the RTI and MTSS um, as much as possible if available. So sometimes English language learners and other students with language and cultural differences are over-identified for special services. And why is that? There's too much emphasis placed on academic and language difficulties, and not enough on the fact that the student is still learning English. So the difficulties that the student is having are seen as a possible disability, and without consideration of the language learning process and the student's native language proficiency. So we need to know the student's performance in their native language or languages to know whether their difficulties are across all the languages that the student knows, or is it just the fact that they're learning English and new content as well, because it is definitely a double cognitive load on students who are learning English and learning new content at the same time. And so we, as educators, we shouldn't be uh, too quick um, to see problems the student is having as a possible disability. On the other hand, um, there are times where students may be under-identified for special education services, and it's the opposite case. Too much emphasis is placed on the fact that the student is still learning English, and not enough on the difficulties that the student is having. So in this case, difficulties are seen as a language learning problem, not as a possible learning disability. And so educators at this point often say, well, they just need a little extra time to catch up, um, when in reality the student actually does have a learning disability, and we shouldn't wait until the student is struggling to identify them. And so in this case, the best thing to do would be, again, to assess a student's proficiency in their native language or languages and see if they're having any learning problems there too. Um, and so we need to be mindful of either under or over identifying students who have language or cultural differences for special education services. We need to look at their overall performance and language proficiencies, um, and use a variety of assessment methods to see where their actual performance.